The tension in the studio was palpable as J.D. Vance stepped in. On the screens of millions of viewers, the special interview with Vice President J.D. Vance was about to begin. This was not just an ordinary conversation, it was a true battle of wits. The host, Marcus, known for his sharp style and biased stance, had meticulously prepared to put Vance in a difficult position. Marcus's assistants whispered among themselves as they watched Vance step onto the stage, calm, confident, completely unfazed. But Vance, a former Marine, was no stranger to high-pressure situations. He scanned the room briefly, sensing that something was off. Marcus leaned forward with a forced smile. "Welcome, Vice President J.D. Vance," he said, deliberately emphasizing each word as if he were setting up his attack. Vance shook Marcus' hand calmly and took his seat. The conversation began with polite questions, but Marcus's eyes revealed his true intent. He was waiting for the right moment to strike. The audience could sense it too, a feeling of anticipation, as if everyone was waiting for the moment Vance would be cornered. But what they didn't expect was that this game was not as simple as Marcus thought. The moment Marcus asked his first pointed question, Vance saw through the real agenda. This wasn't an interview, it was an ambush on live television, and he knew exactly how to turn Marcus' trap into a double-edged sword, flipping it back on his opponent before the entire nation. From the very first moment, this intellectual battle was already tilting in J.D. Vance's favor. Marcus raised an eyebrow, a smug glint in his eyes as he flipped through his notes. "Mr. Vance," he began, deliberately slowing his speech for effect, "you were once a harsh critic of President Trump before becoming one of his closest allies. Some might call that opportunism. What do you say to that?" The question was laid out like a perfect trap, and Marcus knew it. The studio fell silent. The cameras zoomed in on the audience, where a few smirks could be seen, people waiting for J.D. Vance to stumble in his response. It was a classic tactic, exploiting an opponent's past contradictions and turning them into a fatal weakness. But Vance didn't even blink. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, his gaze as steady as that of a battle-hardened soldier. "I'm glad you brought that up, Marcus," he replied, his tone calm but commanding, "because it gives me the opportunity to talk about something the media often overlooks, the right to change when confronted with the truth." A murmur spread through the audience. This wasn't a deflection, it was a direct counterattack. Vance continued, his voice growing sharper. "I grew up in a working-class family. I witnessed firsthand the struggles of people abandoned by the system. When I criticized President Trump in the past, I was seeing things through my own narrow lens. But then I saw with my own eyes what he accomplished. Jobs returning, the economy thriving, communities that Washington had long forgotten finally having hope again. So tell me, should I have clung to my own arrogance, refusing to acknowledge reality just to maintain an old opinion? Or should I have had the humility to admit that I was wrong?" Marcus clenched his notes tighter. This was not the response he had been expecting. Vance offered a slight smile, but his eyes were as sharp as a blade. "Have you ever changed your mind after gaining new understanding, Marcus? Or do you believe that stubbornly clinging to a position, no matter how reality shifts, is a sign of intelligence?" The air in the room seemed to be sucked out. Some audience members applauded while others sat in stunned silence. Even Vance's critics had to admit he had just flipped the game. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but for the first time in the interview, he was no longer in control. Marcus clenched his jaw, realizing that the interview was slipping from his grasp. He scrambled to regain control, quickly flipping through his notes, searching for a new line of attack. "Well then, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. "Recently you spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast, stating that faith should have a place in government. Don't you think you're overstepping? The U.S. Constitution clearly mandates the separation of church and state." The camera zoomed in on J.D. Vance's face, but there was no sign of concern. He leaned back in his chair, exuding absolute composure. "Marcus, I'm glad you asked that," Vance replied, his voice steady and deliberate. But let me remind you of something. When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on a Bible, not a government report." The room erupted in applause. Vance wasn't just answering the question, he was putting Marcus on the defensive. Marcus swallowed hard but struggled to maintain his composure. "But don't you think that contradicts the principle of a secular government?" Vance tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. "You know what's interesting, Marcus? When I was a Marine, no one objected when a chaplain prayed before every mission. No one complained when we knelt and asked God to protect our brothers. But when a leader speaks about faith, suddenly it's a problem?" Marcus pursed his lips, realizing he had just backed himself into a corner. Vance pressed on. "Faith is not a threat to government. It is what built the foundation of this nation. And let me be clear, freedom of religion does not mean erasing faith from public life. It means that no one can be forced to abandon their beliefs." The room was silent for a brief second before another wave of applause swept through, louder than before. Marcus glanced at his production team, silently searching for help. But no one could rescue him now. J.D. Vance had just scored another point. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to mask his unease. He quickly flipped through his notes, searching for a counterstrike to regain control. "Well then, Mr. Vance," Marcus said, forcing a calm tone, "you speak a lot about tradition and morality, but don't you think this country should move forward instead of clinging to outdated values?" Vance raised an eyebrow as if he had just heard something absurd. Slowly he placed both hands on the table, locking eyes with Marcus. "Are you saying that morality, family, and patriotism are outdated values?" He shook his head slightly. "No, Marcus, the issue isn't whether we move forward or go back. The issue is, which direction are we moving in?" The entire studio fell silent, waiting for the next response. Marcus hadn't realized he had just handed J.D. Vance an opportunity for an even stronger counterattack. Vance continued, his voice steady but razor sharp. "If progress means weakening families, erasing faith, rewriting history, and making hard-working Americans feel like strangers in their own country, then tell me, Marcus, is that truly progress?" Applause erupted again, this time lasting even longer. Marcus blinked, struggling to maintain his composure. "Do you know what's actually outdated, Marcus?" Vance pressed on, his tone cold and cutting. "The kind of politics you're playing right now." Marcus froze. "I don't think." "Don't think what?" Vance interrupted, refusing to give Marcus room to recover. "Don't think that the American people deserve the truth instead of media games?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but this time the audience had already chosen their side, and it wasn't his. He blinked rapidly, swallowed hard, and struggled to maintain professionalism, but he knew it. He was losing control. The interview that was supposed to be a trap for J.D. Vance had turned into a courtroom reversal, where Marcus was now the one being scrutinized. Clenching his jaw, Marcus attempted to regain his footing. "But, Mr. Vance," he said, his voice slightly rushed, "you're avoiding the question. America today isn't the America you describe. We are moving toward a more diverse, open society. So why do you insist on defending outdated values?" Vance leaned back in his chair, a faint smile flickering across his face. Marcus was panicking. "Outdated?" Vance repeated, as if tasting the word. He leaned forward slightly, his voice slow but razor-sharp. "Do you know what's truly outdated, Marcus? A media class that believes it has the right to decide for the American people what is right and what is wrong?" The studio fell into complete silence. "You think America today is different?" Vance continued. "No, Marcus, America is still the same. The American people still want their families protected, their jobs secured, and their country respected. The only ones who think otherwise are people like you, those who live in a media bubble trying to convince them that these values no longer matter." Marcus blinked, his grip tightening on his notes. He hadn't expected his own question to backfire so badly. Vance turned directly to the camera. "And that is what the American people truly need to hear." The audience rose to their feet in applause. while Marcus sat in silence. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to regain control of the interview, but J.D. Vance wasn't giving him the chance. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice slightly unsteady, "you seem to enjoy talking about tradition. But isn't America a nation of change? Aren't the values you defend actually holding back progress?" Vance smiled faintly, but his eyes were sharper than ever. Marcus was grasping at straws. "Marcus," Vance said, his voice deep and resolute, "do you know what real progress is? It's not about erasing history or discarding the values that built a great nation. Progress is when we honor the past to build a better future, not destroy it for the sake of temporary political trends." Marcus fell silent. Some members of the audience nodded in agreement, while others exchanged astonished glances. Vance pressed on, his voice commanding. "You talk about change, then look at who is truly changing. I changed when I saw the truth. I had the courage to admit I was wrong about President Trump, and I'm not afraid to say it. But what about you, Marcus? Do you have the courage to change, or will you keep clinging to the same scripted narratives, even when you know they're no longer true?" The room held its breath. Marcus fumbled for a rebuttal, but no words came out. Vance sat upright, a calm smile on his face. "And that, Marcus, is the difference between us." The audience erupted in applause while Marcus sat frozen in place, completely defeated. Marcus clenched his teeth, trying to maintain his composure under J.D. Vance's relentless counterattacks. He knew he was losing, but he refused to surrender. Flipping through his notes at a frantic pace, he searched for a way out, a weakness to exploit. And then, with a desperate glimmer of hope, he threw out one final question, a last-ditch effort. "Mr. Vance," Marcus said, his voice tense, "you talk a lot about tradition, about morality, about faith, but let's be honest. This isn't about America. This is about power. You're not a leader. You're just Trump's puppet, aren't you?" Silence fell over the room. Some audience members gasped, unable to believe Marcus' audacity. But Vance? He just sat there, calm, composed, like a warrior before the storm. He tilted his head slightly, a faint smile appearing. "Do you really believe that, Marcus?" Vance asked slowly. "Or are you just saying what someone else told you to say?" Marcus blinked, hesitation flickering for just a moment, but Vance didn't stop. "You call me a puppet? I served in the Marine Corps. I've stood on battlefields making decisions that affected human lives, and you, a journalist, sitting safely in a studio, dare lecture me about independence?" The audience exploded into applause and cheers. Marcus was completely stunned. He had nothing left to say, nowhere to hide. J.D. Vance had turned the entire exchange around and left him defeated on his own turf. Marcus was speechless. His final question, the last desperate attack he had put all his effort into, had been effortlessly dismantled by Vance like a brittle matchstick. The entire studio fell into silence, broken only by the hushed murmurs of the audience, people who had just witnessed a confrontation they would never forget. J.D. Vance didn't gloat, he didn't mock his opponent or twist the knife. He simply sat upright, his gaze unwavering, and let out a steady breath. "Marcus," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to speak the truth, and the truth is, the American people are tired. Tired of shallow attacks, tired of empty smears, tired of the political games that you and your colleagues continue to play." Applause erupted, louder than ever before, not just from the audience in the studio, but even from some members of the production team, who nodded in agreement. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes darting toward the producer, who was now signaling to cut the segment short. But it was too late. J.D. Vance had already won, not just this debate, but the hearts and minds of millions watching. Vance rose to his feet and extended his hand to Marcus. "Whether you agree with me or not, I still respect your right to free speech," he said, exuding the presence of a true leader. "But next time come with a real story, a solid truth, rather than cheap tricks." And with that he walked off the stage, leaving Marcus drowning in defeat, while America had just witnessed a historic moment. Lesson from the interview: stand your ground and use truth as your weapon. The story of J.D. Vance's interview was not just a political showdown. It was a powerful lesson in handling challenges in life. Marcus attempted to trap Vance with manipulative questions, but Vance not only avoided the pitfalls, he turned the entire situation around with composure, sharp reasoning, and most importantly, the truth. In life, we will face moments where others try to undermine us, apply pressure, or shake our beliefs. The key is to stand firm, not let emotions take over, and counter with the truth. When someone tries to distort a narrative or put you on the defensive, do what J.D. Vance did. Take a deep breath, analyze the situation, and respond with solid arguments. Additionally, this story reminds us that confidence and preparation are key. If you enter a conversation or debate without a solid foundation of knowledge, you are more likely to falter. But if you come prepared with facts and sharp reasoning, no one can manipulate or derail you. Always equip yourself with knowledge, composure, and critical thinking, because that is true strength. 0.897